Montana, 1885. A land that takes everything and gives back nothing but dust. Caleb Walker was a man drowning in debt and silence, waiting for the winter to finally bury his pride. But then, he found something in his hayloft that the ledgers couldn't account for. A mother, starving and fierce, clutching a child as if they were the last two souls on earth. He should have turned them away. He should have looked to his own survival. But Caleb made a choice. A choice that didn't just save them, it ignited a war against the most powerful men in the valley. Stay with us as we uncover a story where the ink of a pen proved deadlier than the lead of a Winchester. Welcome to our channel, where we breathe life into the untamed frontier, sharing timeless tales of Western grit, the enduring bond of motherhood, and the quiet power of human compassion. Today's story reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in acres or gold, but in the courage to stand for someone who has no one else. It's a lesson in the radical dignity of the human spirit. If this journey into the heart of the Old West moved you, please tip your hat by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Drop a comment below. What would you sacrifice to protect a stranger?
The wind in Montana didn't just blow. It hunted. It was a jagged, invisible thing that chased the heat from a man's bones and turned the marrow into ice. Caleb Walker leaned into the gale, his shoulder pressed against a rotted fence post as he swung the heavy mallet. Clack! The sound was dull, swallowed almost instantly by the vast, gray emptiness of the Bitterroot Valley. He wiped a mixture of sweat and freezing rain from his brow with a hand that felt more like a slab of scarred leather than human flesh. At 35, Caleb felt 80. His back was a map of old aches, and his heart was a dry well, but the fence had to hold. If the fence failed, the few head of cattle he had left would wander into the timber, and the bank would have its excuse to take the land a month early. He looked toward the horizon, where the sky was bruising into a deep, ugly purple. Another blizzard was coming. In 1885, a late autumn storm wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for the unprepared. "Just one more mile of wire," he muttered, his voice raspy from days of silence. "Just one more day of luck." But luck had abandoned the Walker Ranch the day his brother, Elias, was buried in the frozen earth 2 winters ago. Since then, Caleb had been a ghost haunted by a ledger. He was a man drowning in a sea of red ink, tethered to a debt he hadn't signed for, yet bound by a family name he refused to let drag through the mud. As the light began to fail, Caleb gathered his tools. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Barnum, shifted uneasily, nostrils flaring. "I smell it too, boy," Caleb said, patting the horse's neck. "Let's get to the barn." The barn was a cathedral of cedar and shadows, smelling of dry hay, old leather, and the sweet, sharp scent of manure. It was the only place Caleb felt at peace, a fortress against the howling world outside. He unsaddled Barnum with practiced, heavy movements. He was halfway through pitchforking a fresh layer of bedding when he heard it. It wasn't the wind. The wind didn't sob. Caleb froze. His hand drifted instinctively to the Winchester rifle leaning against the grain bin. There were desperate men in the territory drifters, turned mean by hunger, or outlaws looking for a place to hole up. He moved with the predatory silence of a man who had survived the wilderness campaign, his boots making no sound on the packed dirt floor. The sound came from the loft, a soft, rhythmic rustling of hay, followed by a sharp, muffled cough. Caleb climbed the ladder, the rungs groaning under his weight. He kept the rifle low but ready. As his head cleared the floor of the loft, he swung his lantern wide, the amber light cutting through the darkness like an axe. Come out slow, Caleb commanded, his voice echoing with a cold, metallic edge. Hands where I can see him. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, the haze shifted. A face emerged from the golden stalks. It wasn't the bearded, grime-streaked face of a rustler. It was a woman. Her skin was the color of parched parchment, pulled tight over high, elegant cheekbones. Her eyes were massive, dark, and filled with a terrifying, feral intelligence. She wasn't just thin, she was fading. Caleb lowered the rifle an inch, his brow furrowing. But before he could speak, the woman shifted, and a small, whimpering cry broke the silence. Tucked into the crook of her arm was a bundle of rags, a child, no more than 2 years old, his face flushed with the unnatural crimson of a high fever. The woman didn't beg. She didn't scream. She reached out a trembling hand and grabbed a fistful of dry hay, shoving it toward her mouth as if it were bread. Caleb felt a physical jolt in his chest. He had seen starvation in the war men, eating shoe leather in the trenches of Petersburg, but seeing a woman in a fine, albeit ruined, silk bodice, chewing on livestock feed in his own barn, struck a chord of primal horror. "Stop that," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "That will turn your stomach to knots." The woman choked on a dry stalk, her eyes never leaving his. He needs heat," she rasped. Her voice was a ghost of a southern accent, refined and shattered. "Please the boy." Caleb looked at the child. The boy's breathing was shallow and wet, the sound of the mountain lung beginning to settle in. If they stayed in this loft tonight, there would be one less soul in the valley by morning. Caleb's mind raced. He thought of the sheriff in town. Sheriff Miller was a man of the law, but the law in Montana was expensive. If he reported them, they'd be processed as vagrants. The woman would be sent to the laundry mines in Butte, and the boy would be lucky to see a state orphanage. Then he looked at her hands. Despite the dirt under her nails, her fingers were long and slender. On her right index finger was a faint, telltale ink stain. "You're a long way from home, ma'am," Caleb said, his voice softening just a fraction. "I am where I was forced to be," she replied, her chin trembling but held high. "My name is Sarah Miller, and I am not a thief. I only sought cover from the ice." Caleb looked at his empty house across the yard, then back at the starving woman. He thought of his own debts, his own hunger, and the crushing weight of the Bitterroot winter. He was a man on the verge of losing everything. Helping her was a risk he couldn't afford, but as he watched her shield the child with her own thin body, Caleb realized that if he turned them out, he wouldn't just be losing his ranch illegally or otherwise. He'd be losing the last shred of the man his mother had raised. "Caleb Walker," he said shortly. He stepped off the ladder and gestured with his lantern. "Come down, carefully." Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to the rifle. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't waste the breath talking," Caleb said. "The boy needs a fire. And you need something that didn't grow in a field." The kitchen was small and smelled of pine smoke and old coffee. Caleb moved with a sudden frantic energy he hadn't felt in months. He stoked the wood stove until the iron glowed a dull cherry red. He pulled a jar of preserved peaches from the cellar and a heel of sourdough bread that was nearly as hard as a rock. Sarah sat at the small pine table, clutching the boy to her chest. She watched Caleb move with the wariness of a trapped animal. When he set a bowl of warm milk and bread in front of her, she didn't dive in. She dipped her finger into the milk and pressed it to the child's lips first. Only after the boy swallowed did she take a bite herself. She closed her eyes, a small, shuddering breath escaping her lungs. "Slow down," Caleb warned. leaning against the counter. Your body won't know what to do with a full belly if you rush it. It has been 3 days, she whispered. 3 days since we had anything but meltwater. Where's the father? The question hung in the air, heavy and cold. Sarah S.'s expression didn't change, but her grip on the boy tightened. The father is a man who traded his soul for a deck of cards and his family for a head start. He is gone, and I pray he stays that way. Caleb nodded. He knew the type. The West was full of men who ran from their shadows, leaving a trail of broken women and hungry children in their wake. I can't keep you here for free, Caleb said, his voice returning to its granite-hard tone. It was a lie he couldn't keep her at all, but he knew she wouldn't accept charity. A woman who held her head like that would rather starve than be a beggar. Sarah looked up, her gaze steady. I have no money, Mr. Walker. I don't want your money. I don't have enough of it myself to know what to do with it. He gestured to a stack of crumpled papers and ledgers on the corner of the table. I'm a man of the dirt. I can break a horse and I can fix a fence. But these banks, they speak a language of numbers I don't understand. They're trying to take this place on a technicality of a loan my brother took out before he passed. He looked at the ink stain on her finger. You look like you know how to wield a pen. You keep my books, you find a way to stall that bank, and you cook what little we've got. In exchange, you get the guest room and a lock on the door. Sarah looked at the papers, then at the glowing stove, then back at Caleb. For the first time, the feral look in her eyes softened into something resembling hope. I was a teacher in Virginia, Mr. Walker, she said softly. I can find the devil in those details. Good, Caleb said, picking up his hat. Then we've got ourselves a contract. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. Outside, the first flakes of the blizzard were beginning to swirl against the glass. He had just invited a stranger into his home, a woman linked to a past he didn't know and a future he couldn't see. The room is at the top of the stairs, he said without looking back. Sleep. Tomorrow, the work begins. And in Montana, the work is the only thing that saves you. As he stepped out into the cold to finish the evening chores, Caleb Walker felt a strange, terrifying lightness in his chest. He was still broke, his ranch was still dying, and the winter was still coming. But for the first time in 2 years, the house behind him didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a fortress. He had found a starving mother in his hayloft, and in that moment of desperate mercy, he realized he wasn't just saving them. He was giving himself a reason to fight for the ground beneath his feet. The dawn didn't break over the Bitterroot Valley. It bled, a thin, sickly gray light seeped through the frost-crusted windows of the ranch house, revealing a world buried under 6 inches of fresh, powdery white. Inside, the air was so cold that Caleb's breath came in plumes of silver mist. He moved through the kitchen with the mechanical silence of a man, long accustomed to being alone. He didn't head for the stairs. He didn't knock on the guest room door. Instead, he went straight to the wood stove. The iron was cold, a dead thing in the center of the room. He knelt, his knees popping like dry kindling, and began the ritual of rebirth. Shaved pine, a strike of a match, the small orange flicker that meant life. He was reaching for the coffee pot when he heard the floorboards groan above him. Caleb stiffened. For a fleeting second, his mind flickered back to the war, the sudden realization that you weren't alone in a trench. Then the memory of the hayloft rushed back. The woman, the child, the ink-stained finger. 10 minutes later, Sarah Miller descended the stairs. She looked different in the gray morning light. The silk dress she wore was a tragic sight The hem was shredded, stained with the red clay of the trail and the yellow dust of the barn. But she had washed her face. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, tight knot that spoke of a desperate attempt at order. She carried the boy, who was wrapped in a heavy wool blanket Caleb had left at the foot of the bed. Caleb didn't look up from the stove. The boy's fever? Broken, I think, Sarah said. Her voice was thin like wire, but steady. He's sleeping. It's the first time he hasn't wheezed in a week. Sit, Caleb commanded, gesturing toward the table. The coffee, mud, but it's hot. He set a tin mug in front of her. As she reached for it, Caleb noticed her hands. They were trembling not from cold, but from the sheer exhaustion of holding herself together. He watched her take a sip, her eyes closing as the heat hit her throat. I looked at the ledgers, she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. Last night, before I slept. Caleb paused, a piece of salt pork halfway to the frying pan. I told you to sleep, not to snoop. It wasn't snooping if the books were screaming, she countered. The Virginia lilt was sharper this morning. You repaying interest on a principal that was already settled 2 years ago. Do you realize that, Mr. Walker? This bank, the Bitterroot Commercial Trust, is charging you a mortality premium because your brother died. It's not just predatory. It's illegal, even in a territory as wild as this. Caleb turned back to the stove, the smell of rendering fat filling the room. The law is a long way from here, Mrs. Miller, and Silas Vance, the man who runs that trust, owns the Sheriff S. boots and the Judge S. coat. Then, we don't look for the law, she said, her voice dropping an octave. We look for the loophole. I spent 4 years as the head mistress of a girls' academy. I have dealt with wealthy fathers who tried to cheat tuition by citing every clause in the book. A banker is just a father with a larger ledger and a smaller soul. Caleb finally looked at her, really looked at her. She was a ruin, yes, but beneath the hunger and the rags was a mind that functioned like a precision-engineered watch. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a mother. He had hired an assassin who used ink instead of lead. Eat your pork, he said, sliding a plate toward her. Then get to work. I got a barn to clear and a roof to before the next wave hits. The day fell into a rhythm of the unspoken. Caleb didn't ask Sarah why she was running, and Sarah didn't ask Caleb why his brother was buried in the back acre instead of the town cemetery. They operated in parallel lines. Caleb spent the morning battling the snow. The physical labor was a purge. He shoveled paths to the barn, his muscles screaming under the weight of the wet, heavy drifts. He spent hours in the loft, reinforcing the rafters that had groaned under the storm as weight. Every time he looked back at the house, he saw a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney. It was a visual anchor, a reminder that the house was no longer a hollow shell. When he returned at noon, the kitchen was transformed. It wasn't clean, the house was too far gone for that, but it was organized. The stack of chaotic papers that had been Caleb's nightmare for months was now neatly categorized into 3 piles on the pine table. Sarah was standing at the counter, her sleeves rolled up, revealing thin, pale forearms. She was scrubbing a pot with sand and vinegar. The boy is in the crate by the fire, she said without turning. I made him a nest of blankets. He's eating a bit of porridge. Caleb walked over to the crate. The child Leo, she had called him, was awake. He had Caleb's gray-blue eyes, though they were wider, and filled with a toddler's silent curiosity. He held a wooden spoon as if it were a scepter. Caleb reached down, hesitating, then awkwardly patted the boy's head. The hair was soft, like corn silk. He likes the fire, Caleb said. He likes the safety. Sarah replied. She turned, wiping her hands on a rag. Mr. Walker, I drafted a letter to the territorial comptroller. We aren't going to pay the December installment. We're going to file an injunction of disputed debt. Caleb laughed, a dry, rasping sound. That just get the sheriff out here with a hammer and a nail for the door. Not if the letter is postmarked from the capital, she said, with a faint, dangerous smile. And not if it mentions that Silas Vance is violating the Federal Land Act of 1862. I may be a starving woman in your barn, but I know how to make a man in a suit sweat. Caleb felt a strange ripple of respect. He had spent his life fighting things he could see sod, storms, and rebel infantry. He had never considered fighting with a piece of paper. Do what you have to do, Sarah, he said, using her name for the first time. Just don't make promises the land can't keep. That night, as the wind began to howl again, Caleb lay in his bed downstairs. He listened to the quiet footsteps above him, the mother rocking her child, the soft murmur of a lullaby that sounded like old Virginia. For the first time in years, the silence of the Montana night didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a truce. By the second week, the borders of their truce began to fray, worn down by the grinding reality of a Montana winter. Survival in the Bitterroot wasn't a heroic act. It was a series of tedious, bone-chilling chores that left little room for the niceties of polite society. Sarah had proven her worth with the Ledgers, but the house was a different beast. Caleb S. Ranch was a Bachelor S. ruin. The curtains were rotted lace, the pantry was a graveyard of empty tins, and the cold seeped through the floorboards like a rising tide. This house is trying to kill us, Sarah remarked one morning as she tried to scrape frost from the inside of the kitchen window. Caleb was lacing his boots, his fingers stiff. The house is just reflecting the man who lives in it. It's as tired, Sarah. Just like me. Tired is no excuse for a draft that could freeze a kettle on the table, she snapped. She had regained some of her strength, and with it, a sharp, imperious tongue that reminded Caleb of the officers he'd hated during the war. We need caulking, and we need more meat. The boy needs fat, Caleb. Real fat, not just salt pork and hope. Caleb stood up, towering over her. He smelled of pine resin and old wool. I'm doing what I can. I've got 5 cows left. If I slaughter one now, we won't have a herd to breed in the spring. Then we might as well hand the keys to Vance today. Sarah didn't flinch. She looked up at him, her dark eyes fierce. And if the boy starves, what does the spring matter? You so worried about saving the ranch that you forgetting to save the people on it. Caleb felt a surge of anger, the hot, sudden kind that comes from being told a truth you trying to hide. He grabbed his coat and slammed the door behind him, the sound echoing across the snowy yard. He spent the day in the high timber, the air so cold it felt like inhaling needles. He tracked a mule deer for 4 hours, his boots sinking deep into the crusty snow. His mind was a storm of its own. He thought about Silas Vance, the bank, and the way Sarah looked at him, as if he were a problem she could solve, if she just had the right ink. He hated how much he had come to rely on her. The house felt different now. It was no longer a place where he just waited to die. It was a place where people expected things from him. They expected heat. They expected food. They expected a future. He finally caught the deer in a clearing as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range. One shot. Clean. Professional. As he hauled the carcass back toward the ranch on a makeshift skid, the exhaustion hit him. He was 35, but in the blue twilight of the Montana woods, he felt like an ancient stone being worn down by a relentless river. When he reached the barn, the lantern light was already glowing in the house. He began the grim work of dressing the deer. His hands were numb, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The barn door creaked open. It was Sarah. She was wearing Caleb's old duster, which swallowed her small frame, and she held a lantern high. "I heard the shot," she said. She walked over, looking at the deer. She didn't turn away from the blood or the visceral reality of it. "Thank you." Caleb didn't look up. "It's meat, like you wanted."
"Caleb,"
she said softly.
She stepped closer, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows across the barn walls.
"I wasn't trying to diminish what you do. I know how hard you work. I've lost everything else. I can't lose Leo." Caleb stopped his knife. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the dim light. She looked fragile, yet indestructible. "I lost my brother," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. "I watched him cough his lungs out in that house. I watched the bank take his pride before they took his life. I am not a good man, Sarah. I'm just a man who's tired of losing." "You saved us," she reminded him. "In the hayloft, you could have walked away. That makes you better than most men I have known." She reached out a tentative, hesitant movement and placed a hand on his arm. Even through the heavy wool of his coat, Caleb could feel the heat of her palm. It was the first time another human had touched him, in kindness, in over a year. He stiffened, then slowly, painfully, he relaxed. "The letter," he said, clearing his throat and returning to the deer. "Did you finish it?" "I did," she said, pulling her hand back and resuming her businesslike tone. "I've also found a discrepancy in the property survey. It seems your brother's original deed included the creek bed, but Vance's new map conveniently omits it. If we can prove the original boundaries, his technicality for the loan becomes a liability for him." "You re a dangerous woman with a pen, Sarah Miller. And you re a dangerous man with a rifle, Caleb Walker. I think the Bitterroot Commercial Trust is in for a very difficult winter." They worked together then, in the cold silence of the barn. Caleb butchered the meat, and Sarah helped him wrap it in cheesecloth to hang from the rafters where it would freeze. It was a macabre dance, but it was a shared one. Later that night, as they sat by the kitchen fire, the smell of fresh venison stew bubbling on the stove, the atmosphere had shifted. The borders hadn't just frayed. They had dissolved. They weren't just two strangers sharing a roof anymore. They were two survivors who had realized that the only way to beat the Montana winter was to stop fighting each other and start fighting the world outside. As Caleb watched Sarah feed Leo a piece of tender meat, he realized the next move wasn't just about the bank. It was about the fact that, for the first time in his life, he was fighting for something more than just dirt. He was fighting for the life that was happening inside the walls he had built. But as the wind rattled the window panes, Caleb knew that Silas Vance wouldn't stay quiet for long. The bank was coming. And when it did, the first Tuesday of December brought a sky so clear, it was terrifying. In Montana, a clear sky in winter meant the mercury had plummeted into a basement where no warmth lived. Caleb stood on the porch, his face stung by the brittle air, watching the trail. He was waiting for the mail rider, but more than that, he was waiting for the first sign of the enemy. Inside, the house had become a tactical headquarters. Sarah had moved the pine table closer to the stove, and it was now a sea of white vellum and black ink. She worked with a terrifying focus, her quill scratching against the paper like a steady heartbeat. "You were going to burn through my entire supply of candles at this rate," Caleb said as he stepped inside, stomping the snow from his boots. Sarah didn't look up. Candles are cheaper than land. Caleb, I finished the rebuttal to Vance's notice of default. I've cited the 1866 Mining Act as a secondary defense. Since there's a creek on your property, the bank cannot seize the land until a mineral survey is completed. It's a stalling tactic, but it's ironclad. Caleb sat across from her, watching her work. She looked stronger now. The hollows of her cheeks had filled in, and the firelight gave her skin a healthy, golden hue. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were no longer the eyes of a starving animal. They were the eyes of a strategist. "Why are you doing this, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low. "You've got the meat I promised. You've got a roof. You could take that boy and head for a city where there are people who speak your language." Sarah paused, her quill hovering over the inkwell. She looked at Leo, who was playing with a set of carved wooden blocks Caleb had whittled for him. "In Virginia, I was a gentlewoman," she said, her voice bitter. "But when the money ran out and the scandal started, I found out that a gentlewoman is just a bird in a cage. When the cage breaks, she has nowhere to fly. Here, on this godforsaken ranch, for the first time, I am the one holding the cage door open. You gave me a weapon, Caleb. You gave me your trust. I won't let that go." Caleb felt a lump in his throat he couldn't swallow. He wasn't used to being someone's trust. He was used to being the man people looked at when they wanted to see a failure. The mail rider finally arrived at midday, his horse frosted with ice. He handed Caleb a single thick envelope, embossed with the seal of the Bitterroot Commercial Trust. Caleb brought it inside. He didn't open it. He laid it on the table in front of Sarah. She opened it with a silver fruit knife she had rescued from the kitchen drawer. As she read, her face went pale, then flushed with a hot, indignant red. "They aren't just calling the debt," she whispered. "They've bought the back taxes from the county. Silas Vance has paid your arrears in full, which, under the current territorial emergency law, gives him the right to act as the interim conservator of the property. He doesn't need to foreclose anymore. He can simply walk in and tell you to leave." Caleb's hand drifted to the holster at his hip. "Let him try." "No," Sarah said, standing up. "That's exactly what he wants. He wants you to pull a gun so the sheriff can hang you for resisting a legal conservatorship. We aren't going to fight him with lead, not yet." "Then what? Were we going to invite him to dinner?" Caleb stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "Invite him? To the house he's trying to steal? He's a man of vanity, Caleb. He thinks he's won. Men like that can't resist an opportunity to gloat. We invite him here under the guise of negotiating a peaceful surrender. And while he is sitting at your table, sipping the last of your whiskey, I'm going to make sure he signs a document that he'll regret for the rest of his life." The plan was madness. It was a gamble that defied every instinct Caleb possessed. But as he looked at Sarah, standing tall against the backdrop of his father's ranch, he realized he didn't want to fight without her. "I'll get the whiskey," Caleb said grimly. "But if he touches his coat for a weapon, the ink stops, Sarah. You understand?" "I understand," she said, her eyes flashing. "But Caleb, wear your best shirt. We going to show him that the walkers aren't broken yet." The night of the dinner arrived with a biting wind that rattled the window panes like a ghost trying to get in. Sarah had performed a miracle with the house. She had mended the rotted curtains, polished the silver service that had been gathering dust since Caleb's mother died, and roasted the finest cuts of the mule deer with wild herbs she dried by the fire. Caleb felt like a stranger in his own home. He was wearing his brother's Sunday shirt, the only one without holes, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. He looked at his hands, scrubbed clean but still scarred, and felt a deep, gnawing sense of dread. Silas Vance arrived at 7, riding in a black carriage that looked like a hearse against the white snow. He was a man of soft edges and sharp eyes, wrapped in a fur-lined coat that probably cost more than Caleb's entire herd. "Walker," Vance said as he stepped into the kitchen, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced disdain. "I must say, I didn't expect such hospitality. I thought I'd find you huddled over a cold stove." "The stove's hot enough, Vance," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "Sit down." Vance sat, his eyes landing on Sarah as she emerged from the shadows of the pantry. He froze, his polished veneer cracking for a fraction of a second. "And who is this?" Vance asked, his voice dripping with forced charm. "I wasn't aware you had a mistress, Caleb. Mrs. Miller is my business associate," Caleb said, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the back of his chair. Sarah stepped forward, her grace effortless. "I am the legal counsel for the Walker estate, Mr. Vance. And I believe you've been misinformed about the status of this conservatorship." The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Vance ate with the confidence of a king, but Sarah met every one of his barbs with a cool, legal precision. She brought up the mineral rights. She brought up the mislabeled survey. She brought up the fact that his emergency law had been stayed by the territorial court just 48 hours ago, a piece of news Vance clearly hadn't received yet. A clever one," Vance said, leaning back and lighting a cigar. The smoke curled around the kerosene lamp. "But cleverness doesn't pay taxes. The fact remains, Caleb is in the red, and I have the ink." "Do you?" Sarah asked. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her sleeve. "This is a sworn affidavit from the widow of your former partner, Mr. Eris Thorne. It details the kickbacks you received from the railroad to devalue the Bitterroot land prices. If this reaches the governor, you won't just lose the ranch. You'll lose your bank, and probably your freedom." The room went deathly silent. Caleb looked at Sarah, stunned. He had no idea she had found such a thing. He realized then that twist 3, the hidden reason she was here, was far deeper than he'd imagined. She wasn't just returning a deed. She had been hunting Vance for a long time. Vance's face turned a mottled purple. He looked at the paper, then at Sarah, then at Caleb. The soft edges of the banker vanished, replaced by the jagged cruelty of a cornered predator. "You think a piece of paper can stop me in my own valley?" Vance hissed. He reached for the inside of his coat. Caleb was faster. Before Vance could even clear his lapel, the muzzle of Caleb's Colt was pressed firmly against the banker's temple. "The lady asked you a question, Silas," Caleb said, his voice as cold as the wind outside. "Do you want to sign the release for the tax lien? Or do you want to see if I've still got my aim from the wilderness?" Vance stared into Caleb's eyes and saw a man who had nothing left to lose. He saw a man who had found a reason to live, and that made him the most dangerous thing in Montana. With trembling hands, Vance took the quill Sarah offered him. He signed the release. "Get out," Caleb said, pulling the gun back just enough for the man to stand. "And if I see your carriage on my road again, I won't be inviting you to dinner. I'll be inviting you to the cemetery." Vance fled into the night, his carriage disappearing into the swirling snow. Caleb stood in the middle of the kitchen, his chest heaving. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. He looked at Sarah, who was leaning against the table, her face as white as a sheet. "Is it true?" Caleb asked. "The affidavit?" Sarah looked at him, a sad, weary smile touching her lips. It's a forgery, Caleb. I don't have an affidavit from a widow. I just know the type of man he is. I knew he'd believe it, because he knows his own sins better than anyone. Caleb stared at her. You risked everything on a bluff? I risked everything on you, she said softly. She walked over to him, and this time, when she reached out, she didn't stop at his arm. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the frantic thrum of his heart. Caleb didn't move. He looked down at her, the starving mother he'd found in his barn, and realized she had saved him in ways he couldn't begin to count. The ranch is ours, Caleb, she whispered. Truly ours. Caleb reached up, his large, scarred hand cupping her face. The next move was no longer about survival. It was about the fact that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone in the dark. He leaned down, and as the blizzard rumbled against the house, he kissed her a kiss that tasted of salt, smoke, and the hard-won promise of a Montana spring. They had survived the bank. They had survived the hunger. But as the fire died down to embers, Caleb knew the real challenge was just beginning, learning how to live in the light they had fought so hard to find. The victory over Silas Vance felt like a heavy golden weight in the house. The release papers sat on the mantelpiece, a tangible shield against the world. But the morning after the dinner brought a different kind of cold. It was the cold of secrets long held, and the realization that while the bank was gone, the shadows within their own hearts were not. Caleb woke before the sun, as he always did, but the ritual felt different. He didn't feel the crushing dread of the debt, yet he felt a new, sharp anxiety. He looked at the guest room door and wondered who Sarah Miller truly was. She was a woman who could forge a legal document with the chill precision of an assassin. She was a woman who knew the soul of a villain because she had lived among them. He was out in the corral, breaking the ice in the water trough, when the rhythm of his life was interrupted. Not by a banker, but by the past. A lone rider appeared on the trail, a man in a dusty duster with a tin star pinned to his vest. It was Sheriff Miller, not Sarah Eskin, but the law of the Bitterroot. He wasn't a bad man, but he was a man who followed the scent of trouble, and trouble had been circling the Walker Ranch like a vulture. Caleb, the sheriff nodded, his horse's breath pluming in the air. I heard there was a bit of a stir out here last night. Silas Vance came into town, looking like he'd seen the devil himself. Said you pulled iron on him. Caleb kept his grip on the ice mallet. He was trespassing on my peace, Sheriff. We had a business talk. He signed the papers. You can see him on the mantel if you've got a warrant. The sheriff spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. I don't need a warrant to tell you to be careful, son. Vance has friends in Helena. But that's not why I am here. Word reached the station about a woman matching a description from a telegraph. Out of St. Louis theft, Caleb. High-level embezzlement from a shipping firm. Caleb S. Hart skipped a beat, but his face remained a mask of Montana granite. The only woman here is my bookkeeper, and she is busy saving what is left of this place. Just be sure you know who is sitting at your table, the sheriff warned, turning his horse. A man who saves a wolf shouldn't be surprised when the sheep start disappearing. Caleb watched him ride away, the silence of the valley rushing back in. He went inside, the heat of the stove hitting him like a blow. Sarah was there, sitting by the window, Leo playing at her feet. She didn't look up, but she knew. He was asking about me, she said. It wasn't a question. He mentioned Saint. Louis, Caleb said, sitting heavily at the table. He mentioned theft. Sarah finally looked at him. Her eyes were weary, the fire of the previous night replaced by a haunting transparency. I didn't steal money, Caleb. I stole time, and I stole a future for Leo. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, tarnished locket. Inside was a portrait of a man who looked like a softer, weaker version of the boy on the floor. "My husband didn't just scam you," she whispered. "He scammed everyone. When he died, the firm blamed me. They said I was the silent partner. I wasn't. I was just the silent observer. I took what was left of our personal savings money they claimed was theirs, and to them, it's embezzlement. To me, it was the price of my son S. life." Caleb looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the embezzler the sheriff spoke of. He saw the starving mother he'd found in the hay, and he saw the architect of his own salvation. They were all the same woman. "The law doesn't care about your reasons, Sarah," Caleb said, his voice rough. "I know," she said, "and I know I've brought that heat to your door. If you want me to leave, if you want to protect what you've just won, I'll go." Caleb looked at the stove, then at the child, then at the woman who had fought for his land more fiercely than he had himself. He thought about the right to be human, the theme Sarah had spoken of. Was a person defined by their worst day or by the light they sought in the dark? "The sheriff didn't have a warrant," Caleb said, standing up. "And this ranch is still a fortress. You aren't a wolf, Sarah. You read just a woman who is tired of being hunted, and as long as I am standing, the hunting stops here." That evening, they didn't talk of law or debt. They talked of the next move in a different sense. Caleb began to teach Sarah how to handle a rifle. It was a lesson in equality. He didn't treat her like a lady. He treated her like a partner. "Steady your breath," he whispered, standing behind her, his arms framing hers as she sighted a fence post. "The iron is just an extension of your will. If your will is strong, the bullet finds its home." As she fired, the kickback sent a jolt through both of them. It was a physical manifestation of their union. They were no longer a man and a stray. They were a unit of resistance. But as the sun set, casting long, bloody shadows over the snow, Caleb knew the sheriff wouldn't be the last one to come knocking. The past has a way of finding its way through even the thickest snow. By mid-January, the Bitterroot Valley was locked in a crystalline silence. But inside the Walker Ranch, something was thawing. It wasn't the weather, the mercury still hid in the bottom of the glass, but the spirit of the place had shifted. The value of the ranch was no longer measured in head of cattle or acres of timber. It was measured in the value of human connection. Caleb found himself doing things he hadn't done in a decade. He whittled a rocking horse for Leo. He repaired the old piano in the parlor, even though neither of them knew how to play. He was building a home, not just a shelter. "You re-humming," Sarah noted one afternoon as she mended one of Caleb's heavy work shirts. Caleb stopped, a flush creeping up his neck. "Just a tune I remembered. My mother used to sing it." "It's in Rowan Tree," Sarah said, her voice soft. "It's a song about home, about roots that go deep into the earth." She walked over to him, the fabric of the shirt draped over her arm. "Caleb, I've been thinking about the creek. If we can build a proper sluice before the spring thaw, we can irrigate the lower pasture. We won't just have 5 cows next year. We can have 50. "That's a lot of work for one man and a woman with a pen," Caleb teased. "It's not work," she corrected him, her eyes bright with a new kind of fire, the fire of a dreamer. "It's a legacy. We not just surviving anymore, Caleb. We rebuilding something that will outlast us. That's the real victory over men like Silas Vance. They build monuments to their own greed. We rebuilding a future for a boy who deserves a world that is kind." The healing wasn't just in the plans for the ranch. It was in the way they looked at each other. The trauma of their pasts, the war for Caleb, the betrayal for Sarah, was becoming a scar instead of an open wound. They were learning that respect was the foundation of love. Caleb didn't demand her affection. He earned it through every log he chopped and every night he spent guarding the door. Sarah didn't demand his protection. She empowered him by being his intellectual equal. However, the twist of fate was never far away. One afternoon, Leo wandered away from the porch while Caleb was in the barn and Sarah was in the cellar. It was a lapse of only a few minutes, but in Montana, minutes are all it takes. Caleb heard Sarah scream, a high, thin sound that pierced the winter air. He ran from the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs, like a trapped bird. He found her at the edge of the woods, staring at a set of small footprints that led toward the frozen creek. "He was just there," she sobbed, pointing. I turned my back for a second. Caleb didn't waste breath on words. He tracked the boy with a grim, focused intensity. He saw where Leo had slipped on the icy bank. He saw the broken ice near the deep pool where the current ran under the surface. "Stay back!" Caleb shouted to Sarah as she tried to rush past him. He moved onto the ice, crawling on his belly to distribute his weight. He could see a flash of blue fabric beneath the translucent gray shell of the creek. The boy was trapped in an air pocket, his tiny face pressed against the ice, his eyes wide with a terror that broke Caleb's soul. Caleb didn't think. He used his bare fists to smash through the ice. The water was a liquid fire, a cold so intense it felt like his skin was being flayed. He reached into the dark, churning water, his fingers grazing the boy's coat. He pulled Leo out, the child blue and silent. Caleb scrambled back to the bank, Sarah falling to her knees beside him. He flipped the boy over, pumping his small chest with a rhythmic, desperate force. "Breathe. You little fighter," Caleb growled, his voice breaking. "Breathe." A moment of agonizing silence passed. Then, a ragged, wet cough. Leo sputtered, a fountain of cold water erupting from his lungs, followed by a piercing, life-affirming wail. Sarah snatched the boy up, sobbing into his hair, while Caleb collapsed into the snow, his hands bleeding and his body convulsing with the onset of hypothermia. That night, they huddled together in front of the massive fireplace. Leo was wrapped in layers of wool, sleeping fitfully but safely. Sarah sat behind Caleb, rubbing his frozen hands with warm oil, her tears falling onto his scarred knuckles. "You saved him," she whispered. "You saved us again." Caleb looked at his broken red hands. "I didn't do it because I had to, Sarah. I did it because he is mine. Yuri both mine. Not like property, but like my own breath." In that moment, the value of life became absolute. They had faced the bank, the past, and nature itself. They had learned that the next move wasn't a tactical decision or a legal maneuver. It was a choice to belong to one another, regardless of the price. But as the fire cast their intertwined shadows against the wall, a new shadow appeared in the window. A man was standing on the porch. Not the sheriff, not Vance. A man from St. Louis, holding a heavy iron key and a warrant that didn't care about the healing of souls. The final twist was at their door, and this time the ink would be red. The man on the porch didn't look like a threat. He looked like a bureaucrat. He wore a bowler hat that had seen better days, and a coat of heavy wool that smelled of coal smoke and city rain. But in his hand, he held a leather satchel that carried the weight of 1,000 miles of pursuit. Caleb stood in the doorway, his frame blocking the warm light of the hearth. His hands, still red and raw from the ice of the creek, were curled into tight fists. Behind him, Sarah had frozen, her hand instinctively shielding Leo, who was tucked into his cradle by the fire. "Caleb Walker," the man asked, voice thin and nasal, echoing the crowded streets of the East. "My name is Arthur Pendergast. I am an agent for the St. Louis Maritime Insurance Group." "You're a real long way from the docks, Mr. Pendergast," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And you re-trespassing on private property. The road is that way. I suggest you find it before the snow gets any higher." Pendergast didn't flinch. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a document, the paper crisp and white, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn timber of the porch. "I have a federal warrant for the recovery of assets and the detention of one Sarah Miller, also known as Sarah Beaumont. She is wanted for the theft of $14,000 in negotiable bonds." Caleb didn't move, but he felt the world shifting beneath his boots. $14,000. In 1885, that was enough to buy 10 ranches like this one. It was a King S ransom, and it was a death sentence. "Sarah," Caleb said, his voice quiet, not looking back, "is this true?" The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of a terrified woman. "The bonds were my father S, Caleb," Sarah said, her voice trembling but clear. She walked forward, stepping into the light of the doorway. "They were his life's work. When he died, the firm absorbed his shares through a series of fraudulent contracts. My husband was the one who signed them away to cover his gambling debts. I didn't steal them. I reclaimed what was rightfully mine before they could liquidate his estate." Pendergast sneered, a small, ugly sound. "The law doesn't recognize reclamation by a spouse or a daughter, Mrs. Miller. It recognizes the signature on the ledger. And your husband's signature is all over those books. The law is a weapon in the hands of men like you," Sarah countered, her eyes flashing with the fire Caleb had seen in the hayloft. "You don't care about justice. You care about the commission you'll get for bringing back the thief." Pendergast looked at Caleb. "Mr. Walker, you seem like a man of honor. A veteran, if I'm not mistaken. You know what happens to those who harbor federal fugitives. You've worked hard for this land. Is a woman you found in a barn worth losing everything you built? Think of your brother S. legacy. Think of your future." Caleb looked at the agent, then at the frozen valley, and finally, he turned to look at Sarah. She was standing tall, her chin up, but her hands were shaking. She looked like a queen in rags, a woman who had been hunted her whole life and was finally tired of running. Then his gaze drifted to Leo. The boy was sleeping, a small, innocent heartbeat in a room full of wolves. "You talk a lot about the law, Pendergast," Caleb said, turning back to the agent. "But let me tell you about the law in the Bitterroot. Out here, the law is what a man can defend with his own two hands. Out here, we don't care much for signatures on ledgers from 1,000 miles away. We care about the person who stands beside us when the blizzard hits. Are you threatening a federal agent, Walker?" "I'm telling you the truth," Caleb said. He stepped forward, forcing Pendergast to take a step back onto the icy porch stairs. "That woman saved this ranch. She found the holes in your friend Silas Vance's books. She worked for her keep when she was starving, and she gave this house a soul again." Caleb leaned in, his face inches from the agent S. "You want her? You bring a U.S. Marshal and a troop of cavalry, because until then, you read just a man with a piece of paper standing on my porch, and my porch is a very dangerous place to be." Pendergast's face went white. He saw the cold, unyielding iron in Caleb's eyes, the look of a man who had survived the wilderness campaign and wasn't afraid of a bureaucrat. "This isn't over, Walker," Pendergast hissed, clutching his satchel. You've made a terrible mistake. You retrading your life for a shadow. I'm trading a shadow for a life, Caleb replied. Now get off my land. He watched the agent stumble back to his horse and ride off into the dark. Caleb stood there until the sound of the hooves died away, replaced by the relentless moan of the wind. When he closed the door, the heat of the house felt suffocating. Sarah was sitting at the table, her head in her hands. You should have let him take me, she whispered. He's right, Caleb. They won't stop. They come back with more than just a satchel next time. Caleb walked over and placed his hand on her shoulder. His touch was heavy, solid, and certain. Let 'em come. I spent 4 years fighting for a cause I didn't believe in just because someone told me it was the law. I am done with that. If I am going to go down, I am going to do it for something that's real. He pulled her up, and she leaned her forehead against his chest, her tears soaking into his shirt. The bonds, Sarah, he asked softly. Where are they? I buried them, she admitted. Under the floorboards of the schoolhouse back in St. Louis. I didn't bring them with me. I knew they'd be my death warrant if I was caught with them. I only wanted to know they were safe for Leo's future. Caleb chuckled, a low, dry sound. So, you re a thief with no loot, and a bookkeeper with no books. You re a mess, Sarah Miller. And you re a fool, Caleb Walker. Maybe, he said, lifting her chin so he could look into her eyes. But I am a fool who finally knows which way the wind is blowing. We've got a fight coming, and it's going to be bigger than Vance. But we've got the ranch, we've got the iron, and we've got each other. The human value of their bond had reached its crucible. It was no longer about a transaction or a truce. It was about a radical commitment to another human being's right to a future. Caleb realized that the next move wasn't to hide. It was to prepare. He spent the rest of the night cleaning his rifles. Sarah sat beside him, sharpening her quill. They didn't speak of the fear. They spoke of the irrigation, the cattle, and the school they would build one day in the valley. They spoke of a world where a woman didn't have to steal her own father's legacy, and a man didn't have to die for a banker-esque greed. As the first light of dawn touched the snow, Caleb looked out the window. The valley was silent, but he knew the ghosts of St. Louis were already gathering their strength. The climax of their journey was approaching, a moment where the ink and the iron would finally meet. And in the heart of the Bitterroot, a starving mother and a broken soldier were ready to write their own ending. The silence that followed Pendergast's departure was not peace. It was the breath held before a scream. Caleb knew how the world worked. A man like Pendergast wouldn't just give up. He would recruit. He would find local muscle, men who wore badges but sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. They won't come at night, Caleb said, his voice gravelly as he stared out the kitchen window at the dawn. They'll come when the light is high. They want the town to see. They want to make an example of the man who dared to say no to the money from the East. Sarah stood by the stove, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. We could leave, Caleb. We could take the horses and head for the high passes. There are places in the mountains where even a federal warrant can't find us. Caleb turned, the sunlight catching the deep lines around his eyes. And then what? We spend our lives looking over our shoulders. Leo grows up thinking his mother is a shadow and his father is a ghost. No, this land is paid for in sweat and blood. If we run now, we just proving them right. We reproving that people like us don't deserve to own anything but our own misery. He walked to the corner and picked up his heavy buffalo rifle. Today, we stand, not just for the ranch, but for the right to be left alone. The morning was a blur of preparation. Caleb moved with a grim military efficiency. He reinforced the shutters, moved the furniture to create barricades, and positioned buckets of water in case of fire. Sarah didn't watch from the sidelines. She cleaned the pistols, her fingers moving with a steady grace that surprised him. "You're not the same woman I found in the hayloft," Caleb remarked, watching her check the cylinders. "The woman in the hayloft was dying," Sarah replied, her gaze meeting his. "This woman has something to live for. There's a difference." At noon, the dust rose on the horizon. 3 riders. Pendergast was in the middle, flanked by 2 men Caleb recognized deputies from the next county over, men known for their willingness to do the dirty work that Sheriff Miller wouldn't touch. Caleb stepped onto the porch. He didn't hide behind the door. He stood in the open, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "That's far enough," Caleb's voice carried across the frozen yard like a gunshot. The riders pulled up 30 yards out. Pendergast tipped his hat, a sneer twisting his face. "Mr. Walker, I've returned with the authority of the law. These men have a warrant for the arrest of Sarah Miller and a court order to seize this property as a sanctuary for a fugitive." "Your warrant is paper," Caleb shouted back. "This land is dirt and iron, and I'm the only law that matters between these fences." One of the deputies, a man with a scarred jaw and a mean streak a mile wide, spat on the ground. "Don't be a fool, Walker. We've got no quarrel with you. Hand over the woman and the boy, and you can keep your shack." The mention of Leo was the final straw. Caleb felt a cold, white heat bloom in his chest. "You want the boy? You'll have to walk over my grave to get to him." The deputy reached for his holster. Caleb didn't wait. He didn't give them the chance to draw. He fired the buffalo rifle. The massive slug tore through the air, hitting the ground inches in front of the deputy's horses. The animal reared, screaming, and threw the man into the snow. "The next one is for the heart," Caleb roared. Chaos erupted. The other deputy pulled his pistol and fired, the bullet splintering the porch railing. Caleb dived behind a heavy oak barrel, his mind flashing back to the trenches of Virginia. He felt the familiar hum of adrenaline, the clarity that comes when the world narrows down to a front sight and a target. Inside the house, a window shattered. Sarah had joined the fray. She wasn't aiming to kill. She was firing at the horses, scattering them, breaking the riders' mobility. She was a teacher, a mother, and now a defender of the gate. Pendergast was screaming, hiding behind his horse, his bowler hat lost in the snow. "You remaking it worse, Walker. You'll hang for this." "I'd rather hang as a man than live as a slave to your ledgers," Caleb yelled back. The gunfight was short but brutal. The deputies, realizing they weren't facing a broken rancher, but a seasoned soldier and a desperate mother, lost their nerve. They weren't paid enough to die in a Montana snowbank for an insurance claim. "Withdraw!" the scarred deputy shouted, scrambling back onto his horse. "It ain't worth it." They fled, leaving Pendergast standing alone in the middle of the yard, his polished boots ruined by the mud and ice. Caleb stepped off the porch, the rifle still smoking. He walked toward the agent, his footsteps heavy and inevitable. Pendergast fell to his knees, his hands raised. "Don't, please. I was just doing my job." Caleb stopped a few feet away. He looked down at the man who represented everything that had tried to crush his soul. He looked at the greed, the coldness, and the cowardice. He could have ended it there. He could have pulled the trigger and buried the problem in the back acre. But then he heard the door open behind him. Sarah stepped out. Leo held tight in her arms. He saw the human value he had fought for. She didn't want more blood. She wanted peace. Caleb lowered the rifle. Get off my land, Pendergast. Go back to St. Louis. Tell them that Sarah Miller is dead. Tell them. The Bitterroot swallowed her. And tell them if they ever send another man like you, he won't be walking back to the stagecoach. Pendergast didn't wait for a second invitation. He scrambled away, running toward the trail without a backward glance. Caleb turned back to the house. His hands were shaking now, the weight of what they had done settling in. Sarah walked down the steps, meeting him halfway. She didn't say a word, she just leaned her head against his shoulder. Is it over? She whispered. Caleb looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip. The danger wasn't gone forever. The world is too small, but for now, the line had been drawn. For today, Caleb said, and today is all we ever had. Spring in the Bitterroot Valley didn't arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a roar. The snow melted in great rushing torrents, the creek swelling with the lifeblood of the mountains. The brown, dead earth suddenly erupted in a sea of wild sage and bitterroot flowers, their pink petals a testament to the resilience of the soil. Caleb Walker stood on the ridge overlooking the lower pasture. It was 6 months since the day in the hayloft, 6 months since the dinner of shadows and the stand against the ghosts of the east. Below him, the ranch was alive. The 5 cows had survived the winter, and 3 new calves were stumbling through the grass on spindly legs. The irrigation sluice that he and Sarah had built was working, a silver ribbon of water feeding the emerald fields. But the real change was in the house. The rotted curtains were gone, replaced by bright calico. The starving mother was now a woman whose laughter echoed through the rooms. Sarah had started a small school in the parlor for the local children, a place where the value of education was taught alongside the value of kindness. Caleb walked down the hill, his step lighter than it had been in years. He found Leo sitting in the dirt near the porch, playing with a puppy Caleb had brought home from town. The boy was healthy, his cheeks red, his eyes full of the wonder of a world that no longer tried to freeze him out. Sarah emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw Caleb and smiled a smile that held the warmth of the sun and the strength of the mountains. The post came, she said as he reached her. She held out a letter. Caleb took it, his heart tightening for a second. But when he saw the seal, he relaxed. It wasn't from a bank or an insurance firm. It was a formal document from the Territorial Governor's office. He read it slowly. Because of the mineral survey Sarah had forced and the legal inconsistencies she had unearthed, the Walker Ranch had been granted a permanent homestead exemption. Silas Vance had been removed from the board of the trust, and the predatory loan was officially vacated. We did it, Caleb whispered, looking at the paper. The land is ours, really ours. No, Sarah said, stepping close and taking his hand. The land was always there, Caleb. We saved the people on it. That's the real victory. They sat together on the porch steps, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the peaks. The air was sweet with the smell of damp earth and growing things. Caleb, Sarah said after a long silence, about the bonds in St. Louis. I wrote a letter to the orphanage where I grew up. I told them where to find them. I told them to use the money to build a wing for children who have no names. Caleb looked at her, his heart swelling with a pride he couldn't describe. You gave it all away? I don't need it, she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. I have everything I ever wanted right here. I have a home. I have a son who is safe. And I have a man who saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving. Caleb pulled her closer. I didn't save you, Sarah. I just opened a door. You the one who walked through it and turned a house into a home. The human message of their journey was clear in the quiet of the evening. They had learned that respect and equality aren't just words. They are the actions of two people who choose to see the best in each other when the world is at its worst. They had learned that a next move made in love is more powerful than any move made in greed. As the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, Caleb thought of his brother, Elias. He thought of the war, the hunger, and the long years of silence. Those things were still part of him, but they no longer defined him. He was no longer the man drowning in red ink. He was the man who had found a star in a hayloft and followed it to a new life. What are you thinking about? Sarah asked softly. Caleb looked at her, then at Leo, then at the vast, beautiful, unforgiving land that they had claimed as their own. I'm thinking, Caleb said, a slow smile spreading across his face, that it's a good night for a song. Do you think you could teach me the rest of the rowan tree? Sarah laughed, the sound as clear as the creek. I think I can manage that, Caleb Walker. I think I can manage that. And there, in the heart of the bitterroot, the echo of their story drifted on the wind. A story of a starving mother, a broken soldier, and the next move that saved them both. The ink was dry, the iron was silent, and for the first time in a long time, the Montana night was full of peace. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
In the vast, bruising landscapes of the American West, we often talk about survival as a matter of grit, iron, and lead. But the story of Caleb Walker and Sarah Miller teaches us a different truth. That the hardest thing to survive isn't a blizzard or a banker. It is the erosion of one's own dignity. When Caleb found Sarah in that hayloft, he was at a crossroads. He was a man drowning in a debt that wasn't his. A man who had every reason to lock his door and harden his heart. In a world that views the poor as a burden, and the stranger as a threat, Caleb's next move wasn't just an act of charity. It was an act of radical recognition. He didn't just see a starving woman. He saw a fellow human being whose value was not diminished by her hunger. This story challenges the very core of how we judge one another. We live in a world obsessed with ledgers, with who owes what, and who is worthy of help. But through the silence between Caleb and Sarah, we learn that respect is the only currency that truly matters. Caleb didn't offer Sarah a handout. He offered her a hand up. He treated her as an equal, a partner in the grueling labor of existence. And in doing so, he restored the humanity that a cruel system had tried to strip away. There is a profound lesson here about the equality of the spirit. Sarah was a woman disenfranchised by the laws of her time, yet she carried an intellect that could dismantle a corrupt bank. It reminds us that potential is often buried under the weight of circumstance. When we provide someone with safety and respect, we aren't just helping them. We are unlocking the gifts they have to offer the world. Furthermore, the story touches on the power of redemption. Both Caleb and Sarah were haunted by the ghosts of St. Louis and the failures of men who came before them. Yet they chose to stop running. They chose to plant their roots in the very soil that tried to reject them. This teaches us that while we cannot change our past, we are not its prisoners. We have the agency to write a new chapter, one defined by the quiet courage of staying, when it would be easier to fly. As the sun sets over the Bitterroot Valley, the message remains clear. Kindness is not a weakness. It is the ultimate strength. In a frontier that was often lawless, Caleb and Sarah built their own law, a law based on compassion, integrity, and the sacred belief that no one should ever have to chew on hay just to see the dawn. May we all find the courage to be a Caleb to someone in the dark, and the strength to be a Sarah when the world says we are finished. Because in the end, we aren't just saving each other. We are saving ourselves.